Hey guys, tonight we begin with a queen's seal, a small oval of wax pressed warm beneath a hand that might never hold a sword, never command a charge, never stand in the mud of Crécy or Agincourt, and yet could still be pulled into war as surely as any armoured man. The easy picture is a woman in a tall headdress, sitting above the world in a castle chamber, wrapped in velvet, safe behind stone. But during the 100 Years' War, safety was not what a crown promised. A crown made a woman visible. It made her marriage useful, her children political, her silence suspicious, her mercy theatrical, and her reputation fragile enough to be broken by rumour. That is the little door we are opening tonight. Not the battlefield first. Not the banner snapping in the rain. We begin in the quieter rooms behind the banners, where a queen's body could become a treaty, where a pregnancy could steady a kingdom, where a daughter's marriage might redirect an alliance, and where a single act of kneeling before a king could be remembered for centuries as compassion, performance, or legend, depending on who held the pen afterward. If you enjoy drifting off to these calm and shadowed corners of history, you can like, subscribe, and comment where you are listening from tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine the wax first. It is not much to look at once the centuries have dried it. A small, hard shape, a crowned figure pressed into it, but in its own time, that seal could travel where the queen could not. It could close a letter, it could authorize a gift, it could confirm land, income, favor, or mercy. It could move through hands that bowed to it, feared it, used it, or questioned it. The seal gave the queen a second body, made of image and law, and that second body could survive in archives long after her voice vanished. A medieval queen was not simply the king's wife, though she was always judged through that marriage. She was a hinge. On one side stood the private world of chambers, childbirth, prayer, clothing, servants, and household accounts. On the other side stood diplomacy, inheritance, public ceremony, and the raw need of a kingdom to believe that power was legitimate. During an ordinary reign, that hinge could already creak under pressure. During the long Anglo-French conflict we call the 100 Years' War, it could become painfully loud. The war itself was not one clean war, fought without pause for exactly 100 years. It was a long series of campaigns, truces, claims, raids, sieges, and bitter pauses between England and France. Kings claimed rights, nobles weighed loyalties, towns calculated survival. Soldiers lived by pay, plunder, hunger, and obedience. Inside that machinery, queens were expected to make instability look graceful. For a Queen of England, France was not only an enemy across the water, it could be family, ancestry, marriage, language, property, or claim. For a Queen of France, England was not only an invader, it could be a rival court, a possible marriage partner for a child, a dangerous negotiator, or a force pressing against the walls of a divided kingdom. The map was political, but the Queen lived it as rooms, letters, journeys, and births. Before she became a queen, she was usually a girl born into another dynasty's plan. Her childhood might include religious instruction, music, household management, manners, languages, and the training of a body meant to be watched. She learned how to move through ceremony before she fully understood what ceremony cost. She learned when to lower her eyes, when to offer a gift, when to remain still while men negotiated around her future. Marriage carried her across borders like a living treaty. The journey could be grand, but it was also a removal. She left familiar rooms, familiar servants, familiar speech, familiar saints, familiar food. In her new court, every gesture could be read. Did she favour the people of her birth? Did she understand the customs of her husband's land? Did she spend too much? Did she give too freely? Did she influence the king too little, or far too much? A queen was expected to belong completely to a realm that might never stop calling her foreign. This mattered in wartime because foreignness was useful when alliances were needed and dangerous when blame was needed. A queen's birth family could help secure peace or attract suspicion. Her accent, servants, clothing, confessor, letters and gifts might all become part of the quiet court arithmetic of trust. Nothing had to be dramatic to be dangerous. A whisper could begin as a complaint about household spending and end as an accusation that the queen loved another land more than the one she was crowned to serve. And yet the same foreign queen could be precious because she connected courts that soldiers could not reach. Her relatives might be dukes, counts, kings, bishops, or mothers of future rulers. Her household could become a small embassy disguised as domestic life. A letter sent through her could soften a demand. A marriage arranged through her kin could matter more than a skirmish. Her power rarely looked like battlefield command. It looked like access. Access is a quiet word, but in a royal court it could be stronger than iron. Who could approach the king when he was angry? Who could ask for mercy without appearing to challenge him? Who could receive petitions from people too low to speak directly to power? Who could transform political need into a scene of tenderness? A queen, at her most useful, could make authority appear human without making it appear weak. That is why stories of queenly intercession mattered so much. One of the most famous memories attached to Philippa of Hainault, Queen of Edward III, is the story of the burghers of Calais, where she is said to have pleaded for mercy after the city surrendered. Whether every detail of that scene happened exactly as later readers imagined is less important than what the story wanted a queen to be. She could kneel, she could weep, she could ask, she could turn punishment into grace, while leaving the king's power intact. But even mercy had a script. A queen did not simply interrupt violence because her heart was soft. She performed a role that people understood, the gentle mediator, the motherly presence, the Christian intercessor. The woman close enough to power to touch it, but not supposed to wield it openly. Her compassion could be praised because it did not openly threaten the king's authority. The room could admire her because the room still belonged to him. So the first truth of being a queen during the 100 Years' War is that power often arrived disguised as dependence. She needed the king's favour, the council's patience, the household's loyalty, the church's approval, the people's affection, and the chronicler's mercy. Yet through those same dependencies, she could shape appointments, patronise religious houses, reward servants, support poets and clerks, protect petitioners, and help turn dynastic marriage into political strategy. At night, the objects around her would not have felt like symbols. The seal was just an object to be guarded. The letters were just letters waiting for a reply. The wardrobe needed cloth. The chapel needed candles. The household needed wages. Somewhere beyond the walls, men were moving through mud, burning fields, guarding roads, counting arrows, bargaining over prisoners. But in the Queen's chamber, war could arrive as a request for money, a rumour about loyalty, a cradle watched too closely, or a messenger waiting quietly with wax under his fingernails. The messenger might have ridden for days before he reached her door. He might have carried news from a port, a siege, a bishop, a son-in-law, a captain who needed money, or a town that wanted protection before its loyalty became too expensive to keep. By the time the letter entered the Queen's chamber, The mud of the road had been translated into ceremony. Someone announced him. Someone received the packet. Someone checked the seal. Someone decided whether the Queen would read it now, later, in private, or in the presence of others. That small delay was part of power. A queen did not live alone with her thoughts. Even privacy had witnesses. Ladies waited near her, clerks wrote for her, chaplains heard her prayers. Servants carried linen, water, lamps, keys, dishes, and gossip. Men of the household watched accounts and access. The chamber was intimate, but it was not modern privacy. It was a soft room full of ears. So when we ask what it was really like to be a queen during the 100 Years' War, we have to remove one very modern idea, that importance means freedom. For a medieval queen, importance often meant fewer unobserved minutes in the day. Her face belonged to ceremony. Her body belonged to succession. Her spending belonged to account books. Her movements belonged to political meaning. If she travelled, people noticed where. If she stayed, people asked why. If she spoke, her words could be repeated. If she was silent, silence could be interpreted. The Queen's household was one of the main machines through which this watched life operated. It was not simply a cosy cluster of personal attendants. It was a working institution full of offices, wages, supplies, favours, and rank. The wardrobe had to manage cloth, jewels, furs, bedding, and ceremonial garments. The kitchen had to feed a moving world. The chapel kept the rhythm of prayer. The chamber guarded the Queen's person. Her ladies brought noble families close to her, and through them, close to influence. In wartime, this household could become a map of politics. A lady-in-waiting might be the daughter of a nobleman whose loyalty mattered. A clerk might carry delicate messages. A gift of cloth might honour one family and cool another. A marriage arranged for someone in the Queen's circle could strengthen a connection. Even the people allowed to stand near her could reveal which faction felt warm and which felt cold. This did not mean every queen controlled a hidden web with perfect confidence. It meant she lived inside a web, whether she wanted it or not. The strands touched her sleeves. They tugged when she tried to move. Sometimes they held her up. Sometimes they trapped her. A queen's money was part of that web. She usually had assigned lands, revenues, or rights meant to support her household and dignity. But income on parchment was not the same as coins in hand. War disturbed roads, harvests, rents, towns, and taxes. A grant could be generous in wording and slow in delivery. Estates could be distant. Officials could be inefficient. Political crisis could turn ordinary payments into arguments. Maintaining queenly magnificence was not vanity alone. It was part of the public theatre of rule. Clothing mattered because people read power through fabric. A queen was expected to appear with the richness that confirmed the king's greatness and the realm's order. Fur, silk, embroidery, jewels, and fine linen were not just luxuries, they were signals. They told foreign envoys that the court was stable. They told subjects that hierarchy still had shape. They told rivals that the royal house had not been diminished. But magnificence had a cost, and in wartime, cost always had a moral shadow. Spend too little, and the crown looked weak. Spend too much, and the queen could be accused of greed, while soldiers went unpaid and towns suffered. This was one of the traps of visible female power. The queen had to shine, but not too brightly. She had to give, but not look wasteful. She had to influence, but not appear to rule. She had to be fertile, but modest. Foreign, but loyal. Merciful, but never disruptive. Holy, but politically useful. Soft enough to symbolize compassion, strong enough to steady a dynasty, and quiet enough not to frighten men who needed her. Childbirth sat at the center of that pressure. In a war over claims, inheritance, and legitimacy, the Queen's pregnancies were never only family events. They were public anxieties carried in a private body. A son could strengthen a line. A daughter could become a future treaty. A miscarriage, stillbirth, or death in childbed could alter the temperature of a court. Even a healthy child arrived wrapped in calculation. Whom might this child marry? What lands might this child claim? Which rival might this birth comfort or alarm? The Queen herself had to endure the physical risk without the comfort of being treated as merely a patient. Her body was watched because the realm had placed hope inside it. Around childbirth gathered prayers, relics, midwives, female attendants, medical ideas that mixed experience with theory, and the deep fear that no crown could keep death from entering a chamber. A queen might be surrounded by the best care available to her age, and still face danger that modern listeners can barely imagine. Yet we should be careful here. It is easy to turn medieval childbirth into a horror scene, and that would flatten the truth. Women then were not ignorant figures moving through darkness. They had practices, experience, female knowledge, rituals of comfort, and communities of care. The danger was real, but so was skill. A queen's birthing chamber was not only a place of fear, it was also a place where women held authority that male counsellors could not fully enter. For a little while, the queen's chamber could become a female world inside a male dynasty. Curtains, bedding, warm cloth, whispered prayers, scented herbs, careful hands, and the low murmur of attendants formed a space where politics waited outside, but did not disappear. Everyone understood that what happened there could change the map. The quiet room was never just quiet. It was a border between flesh and law. And once the child was born, the Queen's work did not end. A royal infant needed nurses, servants, clothing, ceremony, protection, and future planning. The mother might not raise the child in the modern, intimate sense, but her identity was altered by each birth. She became more secure if she produced heirs, more useful if she produced marriageable children, more exposed if succession remained uncertain. Love may have existed, tenderness may have existed, grief certainly existed, but the records often show us the political outline more clearly than the private feeling. That is one of the sadnesses of studying queens in wartime. We can often see what they were used for before we can hear what they felt. Their letters, gifts, foundations, petitions, and reputations leave traces. Their inner weather usually does not. A queen might mourn a child, fear a battle, miss her homeland, dislike a courtier, or pray for peace with an intensity no clerk could capture. But unless that feeling crossed into an action someone recorded, history leaves it dim. And in that dimness, where feeling disappears unless it leaves a mark in wax or ink, the Queen becomes both close and distant. We can follow her through accounts. We can see cloth bought for her gowns, payments made to her servants, offerings sent to shrines, messengers riding between households, gifts given at Christmas, robes prepared for ceremony. We can sometimes see where she travelled and whom she received. But we cannot sit beside her at the hour when a rumour first reached her, or when news came that a campaign had failed, or when a child had been promised into a marriage that would carry the family's fear into another court. This is why the records can feel almost cruel. They preserve the machinery and blur the person. They show the Queen as a function, wife, mother, intercessor, patron, foreign link, ceremonial body. They tell us what she did, what was spent around her, what was expected of her, and what others later claimed she meant. They rarely pause to ask whether she was tired, but tiredness must have been everywhere. Not always the dramatic exhaustion of flight or siege, though some royal women knew those fears too, but the slow tiredness of being required to mean something all the time. A queen's public body was never neutral. When she entered a hall, people saw rank. When she attended mass, they saw piety and order. When she gave alms, they saw charity performed by power. When she sat beside the king, they saw dynastic continuity. When she was absent, absence itself could become a message. During the 100 Years' War, that burden grew heavier because the kingdoms themselves were anxious about legitimacy. Edward III of England did not merely fight the French king as a neighbour, he pressed a claim to the French crown through his mother, Isabella of France. That fact alone reminds us that royal women could be treated as channels through which rights, blood, and arguments travelled, even when those arguments were later controlled by men. A woman's lineage could help launch a claim that armies then carried across the sea. So a queen's ancestry mattered in ways that were both abstract and intimate. Her family tree could become a weapon. Her children could become proof. Her marriage could become a bridge or a wound. A princess born into one house might be sent into another with songs, prayers, jewels, and smiling speeches, while everyone understood that her real dowry was not only land or money, it was the possibility that her body might produce a future peace, a future claim, or a future quarrel. For Philippa of Hainault, queenship in England placed her beside one of the most aggressive royal claimants of the age. She has often been remembered with warmth, generous, pious, gentle, beloved. That memory has reasons. She gave birth to many children. She patronized religious and cultural life. She accompanied the court. She acted as regent when Edward campaigned abroad. And in the famous Calais story, she stands as mercy beside conquest. But even a favourable memory can become a kind of veil. To be remembered as good is not the same as being understood. Think of the pressure inside that goodness. A queen, praised for mercy, had to be merciful in a way that supported royal power. A queen, praised for fertility, had to endure pregnancies without being reduced to them, though history often does exactly that. A queen praised for loyalty had to make her own judgment disappear into her husband's cause. Philippa's reputation is gentle, but the world around her was not. Her softness, as later memory shaped it, worked because it stood beside a king whose war needed both force and grace. Regency reveals the contradiction more clearly. When a king left the realm, someone had to keep authority breathing at home. A queen could participate in that work, especially when her status, household, and networks made her useful. But a queen acting in government did not suddenly become free of gendered expectation. Her authority had to look like service, guardianship, loyalty, necessity. She could be trusted because she acted in the king's name, not because the political culture had calmly accepted female rule as ordinary. That distinction mattered. To act for an absent husband was one thing. To appear to dominate a present or weakened husband was another. The same skills that made a queen valuable could become dangerous if the story around her changed. Counsel, access, spending, patronage, and foreign kin could be praised under one set of circumstances and condemned under another. A queen did not need to change completely for her reputation to change. The political weather could change around her. No queen shows that more painfully than Isabeau of Bavaria, Queen of France. She entered the French court as a young foreign bride and became queen to Charles VI, whose periods of severe mental illness created one of the most unstable royal situations in late medieval Europe. A king who could not always govern placed terrible pressure on everyone around him. Princes, dukes, councillors, servants, and factions moved toward the centre. The queen, because she was both close to the king and mother to his children, could not remain untouched. Here, queenship becomes less like a jewel and more like a candle carried through a room full of dry straw. Isabeau had to exist inside a kingdom divided by rival factions, wounded by war, and shaken by the king's illness. Her role as wife did not protect her from politics, it pulled her into them. Her role as mother did not make her safe, it made every child a possible stake in the struggle. Her foreign birth did not simply decorate her identity, it gave enemies an easy handle when blame needed a shape. The accusations against her became dark and ugly: extravagance, sexual misconduct, betrayal, unnatural motherhood, foreign corruption. Some of those charges grew from the poisonous soil of factional politics and misogyny. We have to be careful not to repeat them as truth simply because medieval writers repeated them with confidence. A hostile archive can sound very sure of itself. Certainty is not the same as fairness. What we can see more safely is the mechanism. When a realm is frightened, it looks for a body to blame. A queen's body is already public. It is already tied to bloodline, marriage, legitimacy, and access. So the same body that was once celebrated as the source of heirs can be turned, in hostile speech, into the source of disorder. Her womb becomes political evidence. Her spending becomes moral failure. Her counsel becomes manipulation. Her foreignness becomes contamination. Her motherhood becomes suspect. That is what it could really mean to be a queen in this war. Not only to live near power, but to have power explain itself through you when things went wrong. When things went wrong, a queen could become the place where a kingdom told its fear to gather. That did not happen all at once. It happened through repeated little acts of interpretation. A feast became evidence. A gift became evidence. A journey became evidence. A private audience became evidence. A mother's decision about a child became evidence. Even a silence could be placed on the table and made to speak against her. For Isabeau, the court around Charles VI did not offer the ordinary shelter people imagine when they hear the word palace. It was a crowded political weather system. The king's illness left spaces where other powers rushed in. His brother, his uncles, powerful princes, and later the rival houses of Burgundy and Orléans, all moved through the weakening centre of royal authority. A queen in that world could not be only ornamental. She was too close to the king, too close to the children, too close to the documents, too close to the question everyone feared. Who speaks when the king cannot? This question was not abstract. Government needed seals, councils, money, commands, marriages, and public appearances. The kingdom could not simply pause until the king was well. War did not wait. Towns did not wait. Armies did not wait. English pressure did not wait. So the French court had to invent temporary answers again and again, and every answer created resentment. If Isabeau was involved, she could be accused of overreaching. If she withdrew, she could be accused of neglect. If she supported one prince, another prince could call her partial. If she sought money for the royal household, hostile voices could call her extravagant. The trap was not that she always made perfect choices and others misunderstood her. The trap was that almost any choice available to her could be made to look suspicious. A queen's motherhood made that suspicion sharper. In peaceful times, royal children were blessings wrapped in ceremony. In a divided kingdom, they became living pieces on a board that no mother could fully control. Sons represented succession, factional hope, and possible government. Daughters represented marriages that could make peace or create new obligations. A cradle becomes a treaty waiting to happen. A girl's future becomes a diplomatic road. A boy's body becomes a possible crown. A mother's chamber becomes a place where the next political crisis is being fed, clothed, prayed over, and watched. The queen may have known lullabies, fevers, little habits, and childish tempers. History, however, tends to write down the marriages. In England, the same dynastic logic could look brighter because Philippa's memory was kinder. Her many children helped build Edward III's royal house into a dense network of marriages and claims. But even that apparent success carried a future shadow. The more children a royal couple had, the more branches of ambition could grow. Sons who strengthened a dynasty could also become the ancestors of rival lines. Daughters who carried alliances could carry claims. Medieval monarchy was always planting seeds it could not fully control. So the Queen's achievement in producing heirs was never a simple ending. It was a beginning with no guarantee. She gave the realm continuity, and continuity produced new contests. She gave the king sons, and sons became magnates, husbands, soldiers, claimants, fathers of further claims. A queen was praised for fertility because fertility promised stability. But history often shows fertility creating more roads through which instability could travel. This is one of the reasons the 100 Years' War belongs so deeply in a queen's chamber. The war was fought with arrows, horses, ships, and sieges, but it was also fought through inheritance. It lived in arguments about blood. It lived in dissent, marriage, law, female lines, and the question of which kingdom would accept the answer. Men might debate those questions in legal language, but women's bodies and marriages often supplied the facts being debated. That did not make queens the hidden authors of the war. It made them essential to reign. They were not outside the battlefield. They were one of the landscapes over which royal legitimacy moved. A queen might never see the smoke from a burned village, but a claim built through her lineage could help send men there. A princess might never vote in a council, but her marriage could redraw the loyalties that council had to consider. Parchment made the connection seem cleaner than it was. A treaty could arrange a marriage in smooth clauses. A letter could speak of love, honor, kinship, peace, and obedience. But underneath the words were bodies that had to travel, conceive, bleed, nurse, kneel, wait, and be seen. Medieval politics often passed through women, or pretending to be made only by men. For the Queen herself, this meant that even her most intimate duties were not entirely hers. Her marriage bed was watched by expectation. Her pregnancies were watched by hope. Her chapel prayers were watched by reputation. Her generosity was watched by accountants and critics. Her friendships were watched by factions. Her grief, if visible, could be praised as pious or judged as excessive. Her joy, if too bright, could become frivolity. She was never only herself in public, and public life reached deep into private rooms. The strange thing is that queens could still act meaningfully inside this narrow space. They made choices. They cultivated allies. They rewarded loyalty. They founded or supported religious houses. They intervened for petitioners. They managed households that were themselves political worlds. They travelled, negotiated, corresponded, hosted, displayed, pleaded, and sometimes endured blame with no clean way to answer it. But their agency had to move like water through carved channels. It could flow, sometimes strongly, but it met stone, everywhere. The queen who pushed too openly risked being described as unnatural. The queen who remained passive risked irrelevance or accusation. The queen who served as mediator could be admired, unless mediation failed. The queen who protected her children could be called maternal, unless those children stood on the wrong side of power. This is why reputation was not an afterthought. It was one of the queen's working materials, as real as cloth or wax. She had to maintain the sense that she was honourable, generous, faithful, fertile, pious, and properly restrained. The court had to believe it. The city had to believe it. Foreign observers had to believe it. Chroniclers, or at least the people who informed them, had to find the story believable enough to pass on. And once a reputation cracked, it could be very hard to mend. Rumour travelled with a freedom queens did not have. It crossed thresholds without asking permission. It entered taverns, council chambers, noble households, and later, pages. It could take a political disagreement and dress it in moral language. It could take a woman's foreign birth and make it sound like treachery. It could take the necessary expenses of majesty and make them sound like appetite. It could take a queen's closeness to power and make it sound like contamination. By the time such rumour became record, the queen herself might have no voice left in the matter. The wax might survive, the accusation might survive, the account book might survive. But the moment when she heard the first whisper and understood what it could become is usually gone. That lost moment matters, because rumour did not only wound a queen after the fact, it shaped the way she moved while she was still alive. A queen who knew she was watched learned to live in advance of interpretation. She did not merely choose a gown. She chose how visible the gown would make her. She did not merely attend a feast. She entered a room where people counted who sat near her, who received her smile, who left disappointed, and which family appeared newly warmed by royal favour. Ceremony was supposed to make all of this look effortless. It wrapped tension in order. It gave everyone a place to stand, a phrase to say, a fabric to wear, a path to follow. When a queen processed into a church, the movement itself told a story. Here was a woman blessed by marriage, guarded by rank, surrounded by attendants, entering sacred space as the living partner of kingship. Candles softened the stone, incense lifted through the air, voices folded into chant. The queen did not need to speak for her body to say something. In wartime, that speech without words became especially valuable. Ceremony could tell frightened people that the realm still had shape. Even if armies failed, even if taxes bit hard, even if rumours of defeat moved faster than official news, the sight of the queen dressed properly, praying properly, giving properly, and sitting properly could make continuity visible. She became part of the kingdom's calm face. But this calm was work. It required planning, money, servants, clothes, horses, litters, chapel goods, jewels, schedules, and bodily endurance. A queen had to appear composed even when travel was cold, roads were rough, news was bad, or pregnancy made every public hour heavier. The courtly image floated above the mud, but the woman inside the image still had feet, bones, breath, and fatigue. Think of a royal entry into a city. The streets might be cleaned and decorated, guilds might assemble, clergy might come out with relics and crosses, children might sing, citizens might watch from windows. The queen's arrival could mean favour, protection, prestige, or expense. The city offered welcome, but it also measured her. Was she generous? Was she gracious? Did she honor local saints? Did she acknowledge the right people? Did she seem like a mother of the realm, or like a stranger passing through? A queen entering a city during the 100 Years' War did not enter an innocent space. Towns were strategic. They had walls, markets, taxes, loyalties, fears, and memories of violence. Some towns had surrendered, some had resisted, some negotiated because survival demanded flexibility. A queen's presence could soothe, impress, or remind people of the crown's claim over them. Her softness carried authority precisely because it looked less threatening than armed force. This is where queenly mercy becomes more complicated than a sweet story. Mercy was not only kindness, it was a political language. To show mercy publicly was to prove that power could choose restraint. A king who spared could appear greater than a king who merely punished. A queen who asked for mercy could give that restraint a human face. She could let authority bend without breaking. So when later memory imagines Philippa pleading for the lives of the burghers of Calais, the scene works because everyone in it has a recognizable role. The defeated city has bodies to offer. The king has anger and judgment. The queen has compassion. Her pregnancy, often included in the tradition, deepens the symbolism. A woman carrying life asks that life be spared. Whether every detail is exact or polished by storytelling, the structure reveals what medieval political imagination wanted from a queen. She could transform conquest into mercy without denying conquest. For the people watching, this mattered. Mercy made domination easier to remember. It gave a harsh event a softer edge. It allowed the court to say, in effect, that power had been severe, but not monstrous. The Queen's intervention did not erase the siege, hunger, fear, or humiliation of surrender. It shaped the memory of what followed. She became the hinge between violence and forgiveness. That hinge could be beautiful, but it was not free. The Queen's compassion had to be acceptable to male authority. If she asked in the right posture, at the right moment, with the right language of humility, she could be praised. If she seemed to command rather than plead, the same act could look dangerous. The line between blessed intercession and improper influence was thin, and other people often drew it after the fact. This thin line followed queens into ordinary requests as well. Petitioners might approach a queen because they hoped she could soften the path to justice. Widows, clerics, servants, townspeople, nobles, and religious houses might seek her support. Some wanted protection, some wanted payment, some wanted a disputed right confirmed, some wanted mercy for someone accused, imprisoned, indebted, or politically exposed. A queen's role as intercessor could turn her chamber into a quieter doorway to power. But every favour created a trace. If she helped one person, another person might resent it. If she supported one religious house, another might be left waiting. If she promoted a servant's kin, critics might see favouritism. Patronage made loyalty, but loyalty made enemies. The Queen's kindness could never remain purely personal once it touched land, money, office, or law. Her religious patronage also carried layered meaning. To give to a monastery, support a chapel, request prayers, sponsor masses, or honour a saint was sincere devotion for many queens, but it was also public memory. Religious gifts asked God for mercy, but they also told the world how a queen wished to be known: pious, generous, maternal, legitimate, humble before heaven, even while exalted on earth. War sharpened that need for heavenly language. Campaigns were uncertain. Disease could undo a plan more easily than strategy. A prince could die young. A fleet could fail. A siege could drag through hunger. The Queen's prayers did not sit outside politics. They gave fear a sacred shape. When she endowed prayers for a king, a child, a victory, a peace, or the dead, she helped place violence inside a story of divine order. Yet here again, the record is uneven. We may find the gift, the foundation, the payment for candles, the name of a chapel, the instruction for prayers. We rarely find the full ache behind it. Was the Queen afraid? Grieving? Politically careful? Truly devout? Most likely, human motives mixed together. A medieval queen did not divide her life into clean modern boxes called religion, politics, family, and public image. They flowed through the same doorway. And at that doorway, there was always someone watching. A clerk with ink, a servant with a tray, a lady with family interests, a priest with memory trained by prayer, a courtier with something to gain, a rival with something to twist. The Queen's day was built from these soft collisions, a folded letter, a bowed head, a candle paid for, a rumour corrected too late, a mercy asked for in a room where everyone would remember who knelt, who listened, and who told the story afterward. A queen's body in motion was never just a body going from one place to another. It was a moving sign of authority, a travelling household, a public expense, and sometimes a quiet risk. When she left one residence for another, the road filled with people who made her movement possible. Grooms, guards, ladies, clerks, chaplains, cooks, laundresses, pages, carters, and officials all had to move with her or prepare for her arrival. Beds, clothing, chapel goods, food, vessels, documents, and gifts had to be packed, carried, guarded, unpacked, and accounted for. To modern ears, a royal journey can sound graceful. We picture a slow procession across green country, horses stepping neatly, banners moving in soft wind. But medieval travel was work. Roads could be broken, wet, crowded, dangerous, or simply exhausting. Weather entered everything. Rain thickened the track, winter made fingers stiff around reins, summer dust clung to fabric. Inns and lodgings varied. Even in royal comfort, travel meant noise, interruption, delay, and dependence on many hands. For a queen during the 100 Years' War, travel also had political weight. To appear in a town was to recognize it. To avoid a place could be read as distance. To pass through a region recently troubled by war could reassure people, or remind them who claimed authority over them. A queen's itinerary could turn geography into relationship. Each stop asked a quiet question. Who receives her? Who pays? Who bows? Who complains? Who uses this visit to seek favour? The cost of hosting a queen could be heavy. Towns and religious houses might feel honoured, but honour came with bread, wine, fodder, lodging, candles, labour, and ceremony. The royal presence consumed. It could bring prestige and opportunity, yet it also required preparation from people who may already have been strained by taxation, harvest failure, military levies, or fear of raids. A queen could be loved and still be expensive. This is another place where the polished image cracks open. The queen's magnificence depended on ordinary labour. Someone washed the linen. Someone cleaned the chamber before she entered. Someone carried water upstairs. Someone found enough straw for bedding. Someone held a horse in cold rain. Someone repaired a torn strap, watched a chest, guarded a jewel, stirred a pot, counted lobes, or swept away the mess after the procession moved on. Those people rarely stand at the centre of royal stories, but without them, queenship could not function. The Queen's dignity was built from their aching backs and practised hands. A smooth ceremony was often the result of many invisible frictions being solved before anyone important noticed. Sleep history asks us to slow down enough to hear those frictions, the cartwheel in mud, the clink of vessels, the muffled order from a steward, the tired servant folding a gown that must look effortless by morning. Inside the court, the Queen had her own rhythms of movement. She might pass from chamber to chapel, from chapel to hall, from hall to private audience, from audience to meal, from meal to rest, from rest to another obligation. Each threshold changed the rules around her. In the chapel, she was a kneeling Christian soul. In the hall, she was a public figure. In the chamber, she was surrounded by women and household officers. Before envoys, she became diplomacy with a face. The clothing changed too, not always dramatically, but meaningfully. A gown for ceremony did different work from a garment worn in a more private room. Jewels could honour the occasion or signal royal confidence. Mourning dress could make grief public. Colours, fabrics and furs carried messages about season, status, wealth and propriety. The Queen's body had to bear these messages even when the day was long. It is tempting to describe these clothes only as beautiful. Some were. But beauty was not the whole point. Cloth was political technology. It created distance. It marked rank. It turned a woman into an image that could be read from across a room. Rich fabric made the Queen larger than her ordinary body. Heavy fabric could also make that body hotter, slower, more tired, and more dependent on attendants. Grandeur had a weight. That weight mattered in war because the court needed visible stability. If the king was away, ill, defeated, victorious, bargaining, or uncertain, the Queen's appearance could help hold the surface of order. People did not need modern newspapers to read signs. They read bodies. They read processions. They read whether the Queen appeared with confidence or restraint, whether she mourned properly, whether she celebrated at the right time, whether her household looked disciplined or excessive. For Isabeau, visible life became especially dangerous because faction made every sign double. A display meant to affirm royal dignity could be described by enemies as luxury. A necessary political meeting could be described as intrigue. A journey could be framed as abandonment. A mother protecting one child could be accused of betraying another. The more unstable the kingdom became, the less neutral any public gesture could remain. In such a world, the Queen's safest posture was often one of careful performance. Not false performance in the shallow sense, but disciplined self-presentation. She had to become legible in the approved ways: pious, dignified, maternal, generous, restrained. The difficulty was that the approved ways could contradict each other. Maternal feeling might pull one way, political necessity another. Generosity required spending, while restraint required economy. Dignity required distance, while intercession required approach. At the centre of it all was the problem of speech. When should a queen speak? To whom? In whose presence? With what words? Medieval political speech was not casual. Requests had forms, letters had formulas, petitions had language. Even emotion could be shaped by convention. A queen might plead, recommend, thank, forgive, promise, or refuse. But each act had to fit the narrow opening available to her. A badly timed word could echo. A well-timed silence could protect. But silence was never simple. It could mean obedience, caution, grief, calculation, contempt, fear, or nothing at all. Later writers might choose whichever meaning served their story. That is why a queen's life can feel like a room of half-heard sentences. We know that words were spoken, but many have dissolved. We know that decisions were made, but the air around them is gone. And so the road, the chamber, the chapel, and the hall all return us to the same fragile truth. The Queen moved through spaces that made her powerful by making her visible, and made her vulnerable for the same reason. Her seal could travel farther than her feet. Her reputation could travel faster than her seal. And somewhere between the two, the living woman had to keep walking. She kept walking because stopping was rarely neutral. A queen who withdrew too far could look cold, frightened, or useless. A queen who appeared too often could look hungry for influence. Between those dangers lay the daily art of being available without seeming ambitious, informed without seeming secretive, persuasive without seeming commanding. It was a narrow road, and it ran straight through the doors of council. Council was not one fixed room with one modern rulebook. Royal government was a living arrangement of people, documents, offices, customs, emergencies, and personalities. Sometimes decisions gathered around the king, sometimes around trusted nobles, sometimes around clerks, bishops, princes, and household officers who knew where the money was, where the letters were, and which promise had been made last month to which anxious town. A queen did not need to sit like a modern minister to matter inside that world. She needed access to the people who did. Access could happen quietly. A word before Mass. A conversation after dinner. A letter sent through a trusted clerk. A petition placed near her by someone who knew that mercy sounded softer in her voice. A request from a religious house that had prayed for her children. A servant's cousin needing protection. A noble family hoping the Queen would remember a past gift. Influence was often less like a thunderclap and more like water finding the smallest channel in stone. That made it difficult for outsiders to measure. It also made it easy to fear. Men who accepted a queen's help when it favoured them could call her meddlesome when it favoured someone else. A counsellor might value her support and still resent her nearness to the king. A prince might seek her alliance and later blame her for the alliance's cost. Influence that remained informal could be denied when convenient, exaggerated when dangerous, and moralized when a woman held it. The Queen's petitions show this world in miniature. People came to royal power with practical pain, lost land, unpaid debts, disputed rights, prisoners, marriages, dowries, pardons, offices, protection for widows, support for churches, complaints against officials. The Queen could not solve all of it, but she could recommend. She could ask. She could add warmth to a request that might otherwise lie cold in a pile of parchment. To be near her was to be near a possible opening. For the person making the request, that opening could feel enormous. Imagine a widow whose income depends on a legal decision delayed by men who never have to hurry. Imagine a small religious house waiting for confirmation of a gift. Imagine a servant who has given years to the Queen's household and now hopes that loyalty can become a marriage portion, a post, or a letter of favour. The Queen's grace could turn service into survival. But grace had bookkeeping behind it. Favours had costs. Gifts had sources. Recommendations had consequences. The Queen's household had to pay wages, maintain dignity, reward loyalty, and keep accounts clear enough that accusations did not grow too easily. Every kindness entered a world where other people were counting. In peacetime, counting could already be tense. In wartime, counting became sharper because money seemed to vanish into armies, ransoms, fortifications, ships, diplomacy, and display. A queen's relationship to war finance was indirect but real. She might not set the kingdom's taxation, but her household lived within the same strained economy. Her estates and revenues could be disrupted. Her need for ceremony remained. Her ability to give depended on income that war could disturb. If she gave lavishly, critics might call her wasteful. If she could not give, dependents might drift away. The queen had to maintain the feeling of abundance even when the machinery beneath it creaked. This was especially delicate because queenship required visible generosity. A mean queen was a failed image. She was expected to give alms, honor guests, reward servants, support churches, and appear as a fountain of grace. Yet a generous queen could be accused of draining resources. The virtue and the accusation came from the same act. A purse opened in charity could look holy to one watcher and reckless to another. The problem deepened when the king himself was absent, young, ill, captive, defeated, or politically weakened. Then the queen's nearness to practical government became harder to disguise as mere domestic virtue. Someone had to receive envoys. Someone had to protect children. Someone had to help maintain household order, dynastic messaging, and symbolic continuity. The queen might become necessary in exactly the moment when necessity made her dangerous. If she acted, she could be blamed for acting. If she did not, she could be blamed for failing the realm. This is the old double bind of female authority, but during the 100 Years' War it had a sharper edge because defeat demanded explanation. A lost battle could be blamed on strategy, supply, weather, discipline, leadership, money, terrain, disease, or chance. But political culture often preferred a more personal story. Someone had corrupted counsel. Someone had weakened the king. Someone had favoured the wrong faction. Someone had failed as wife or mother. For Isabeau, the illness of Charles VI made this problem almost unbearable. When the king was lucid, authority could still gather around him. When he was not, the realm had to operate through substitutes, and substitutes invited rivalry. The queen's place near the king and the royal children gave her significance that no hostile observer could ignore. Her involvement in governance could be presented as duty. It could also be twisted into ambition. This is why her enemies did not merely accuse her of bad judgment. They attacked the categories that made queenship honourable: chastity, motherhood, loyalty, piety, restraint. To damage a queen politically, it was often effective to damage her morally. A man might be called a traitor or a fool. A queen could be called unnatural. That word did terrible work. It suggested that she had failed not only in policy, but in womanhood itself. Such accusations tell us as much about fear as about fact. A queen who could not be easily removed by ordinary political language had to be made monstrous in social language. If her influence seemed inconvenient, it could be reframed as seduction. If her spending seemed politically useful to opponents, it could be reframed as appetite. If her alliances shifted, they could be reframed as betrayal. A hostile story turns complexity into character flaw, because character flaw is easier to remember. And still, beneath all this, the practical day continued. Letters had to be answered, children had to be placed, servants had to be paid, chapels had to be supplied, petitioners had to wait in outer rooms, news had to be judged before it became public. The Queen might hear that a town had changed loyalty, that a truce had failed, that a prince had quarrelled, that English forces were moving, that a marriage possibility had opened or closed. Every item was a thread, and too many threads could knot around her hands. So perhaps the truest image is not the queen on a throne. It is the queen at the edge of a table where documents lie folded, listening while others speak, knowing that if she reaches for one paper, someone will later remember which one. Her hand might hover there for only a moment, but in a court built from memory, that moment could lengthen after she left the room. A folded document was never only paper. It could contain a marriage proposal, a request for safe conduct, a complaint from a town, an appeal for mercy, a financial order, a report from the front, or a careful sentence designed to sound friendly while carrying threat inside it. The Queen lived near such documents because queenship lived near the future. The future, in a royal house, usually arrived as a child before it arrived as a treaty. A son in the nursery was not yet a ruler, but people already imagined him as one. A daughter learning prayers and manners was not yet a bride, but others already saw roads extending from her body toward Burgundy, England, France, Hainaut, Navarre, Brittany, or some other name on the political map. Childhood in a royal family was brief in the mind of government. A cradle was already surrounded by negotiators. For the Queen, this could make motherhood feel strangely divided. There was the child as a living person, warm, difficult, vulnerable, beloved, or perhaps complicated in ways no record can show us. And there was the child as a future instrument, measured by birth order, health, sex, inheritance, alliance, and usefulness. The same small hand that reached for a nurse might one day seal a peace, inherit a quarrel, or be sent away to secure a promise that soldiers had failed to keep. Royal daughters carried this burden with particular quietness. They were often taught to become bridges. A princess might be promised while still young, moved across languages and customs, and expected to create loyalty through marriage. She could be loved by her mother and still be offered into a negotiation. That is not because medieval parents were without feeling. It is because dynastic feeling and political necessity were braided together so tightly that separating them would have seemed almost impossible. A queen who arranged, supported, resisted, or accepted such marriages was working inside one of the central machines of war. Peace was often imagined through marriage because marriage gave political promises a body. A treaty might be broken by ambitious men, but a bride created kinship, ceremony, dowry, public expectation, and future children. She made the agreement visible at dinner, in chapel, in bedchamber, in baptism, and in the next generation. Yet marriage did not guarantee peace. It could postpone violence, redirect it, or give it new language later. The daughter married into an enemy or rival house might become a link, but she could also become a hostage to fortune. If relations soured, her loyalties would be questioned. Was she faithful to her husband's people, or to the blood that sent her there? Did she carry messages? Did she plead for moderation? Did she suffer quietly while men around her turned family into strategy? The Queen understood this because she had often been such a daughter herself. Before she was mother of the realm, she had been sent. She knew the strangeness of a rival, the careful learning of another court, the need to make foreignness less threatening without erasing it completely. When she looked at her daughters, she may have seen affection, duty, memory, and political calculation in the same glance. The records will not give us that glance. But the structure of her life tells us why it mattered. Sons were different, but not simpler. A son promised continuity, and continuity gave comfort. Bells could ring, courtiers could smile with real relief, poets and clerks could make the birth sound like providence. But a son also created a future power center. He would need a household, tutors, servants, lands, companions, and eventually, allies. As he grew, people would gather around him. Every royal child became a small court in preparation. In England, Edward III and Philippa's many children gave their dynasty strength and splendor, but they also filled the future with branches. Those branches would later matter in ways no mother standing beside an infant's cradle could entirely control. This is one of monarchy's quiet ironies. A queen could do exactly what the realm asked of her by producing heirs, and those heirs could become the roots of later rivalry. Success did not end danger. It multiplied possibility. For a Queen of France in the troubled reign of Charles VI, children carried an even more immediate charge. The king's illness, factional conflict, and English claims meant that royal offspring were not simply signs of hope, they were pieces in a struggle over who could speak for France, who could inherit France, and what France itself would mean if the king's authority cracked. A child's marriage could tilt a faction. A child's death could close one path and open another. A child's reputation could become a battlefield before the child had any real power at all. This is where the Queen's chamber touches diplomacy most intimately. Envoys might speak in formal halls, but the substance of their work often led back to children, dowries, households, inheritance, and the promises attached to bodies. A marriage agreement had to consider age, rank, legitimacy, money, lands, ceremony, timing, and the honor of both sides. It had to turn fear into language polished enough to be read aloud. Letters made that polish possible. Medieval political letters could sound beautifully controlled. They used courtesy, kinship, Christian language, honor, affection, and obedience. But beneath those graceful words lay pressure. A phrase of friendship could conceal distrust. A statement of loyalty could be a demand for proof. A gentle reference to family could remind the reader of obligation. The Queen, trained in ceremony and relationship, belonged naturally to this world of careful wording. She might not always write with her own hand. Many royal letters passed through clerks who shaped formula and style. But authorship in this world was broader than handwriting. To command a letter, approve its message, attach a seal, send it through a trusted route, or receive one in a guarded chamber, was to participate in political speech. The Queen's voice might come to us through a clerk's trained phrases, but that does not mean there was no Queen behind them. Still, we have to be cautious. A surviving letter is not a private diary. It is a formal object made for a purpose, shaped by convention, and often written with an audience in mind. When it sounds tender, the tenderness may be real, strategic, or both. When it sounds obedient, the obedience may be sincere, expected, or protective. A queen's written words can reveal her world without opening her soul completely. That partial opening is enough to show the pressure. The Queen stood at the crossing of affection and policy. Her children were loved and negotiated. Her kin were family and leverage. Her letters were personal and official. Her seal was an image and an instrument. And all around her, the war kept turning human bonds into political roads. Those roads did not always lead toward peace. Sometimes they led to a table where peace itself had been reshaped by exhaustion, fear, and defeat. By the early 15th century, France was not only fighting England, it was fighting itself. The rivalry between Burgundian and Armagnac factions tore through the political body of the kingdom. Paris, princes, towns, councils, and households moved under the pressure of civil conflict as much as foreign war. In that fractured world, a queen's presence near negotiation could become both necessary and unforgivable. The Treaty of Troyes, agreed in 1420, sits like a cold stone in the story of Isabeau of Bavaria. It recognised Henry V of England as heir to the French throne through marriage to Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI and Isabeau. It effectively set aside the Dauphin Charles, the Queen's own son, whose cause would later survive and harden into the French royal recovery. To later French memory, the treaty could look like betrayal carved into parchment. And because Isabeau was queen, mother, foreign-born, and already surrounded by hostile rumour, that parchment helped fasten blame to her name. But to understand what it was like to be inside such a moment, we have to resist the clean comfort of hindsight. People living in 1420 did not know the ending. They did not know which claim would triumph, which memory would harden, which son would be vindicated, which daughter's marriage would become a symbol of humiliation, or which signatures would be remembered as treason. They knew a kingdom exhausted by war, a king whose illness had weakened royal authority, a murdered duke, armed factions, English victories, and the terrible need to make some kind of order out of collapse. This does not make the treaty gentle. It does not absolve every choice. It simply restores the pressure that later moral stories often remove. A queen in that room did not stand above the storm like a playwright arranging tragedy. She stood inside a broken political machine where every available lever was already stained. To support one outcome was to wound another. To preserve the idea of monarchy might mean sacrificing a son's claim. To protect a daughter through marriage might mean helping the enemy enter the family. To seek order might look, later, like surrender. Catherine of Valois, the daughter in this arrangement, reminds us that queenship was reproduced through girls who had little control over the wars their marriages were meant to settle. She was not only a bride in a grand alliance, she was the living bridge between English ambition and French crisis. Her body carried the promise that Henry V's line might inherit France without needing every castle to be taken by force. The marriage ceremony made conquest look like kinship. For Isabeau, as mother, that must be approached carefully. We cannot know the private weather of her heart. We cannot invent a scene of tears, rage, cold calculation, or relief. What we can say is that the political structure placed her in a role almost impossible to inhabit without damage. If she supported the settlement, she could be remembered as betraying her son. If she resisted and the realm fell deeper into chaos, she could be blamed for prolonging disaster. In a divided kingdom, motherhood itself could be split by law. This is one of the cruelest facts of royal life. A mother could have more than one child, but politics often demanded that she appear to choose one future. A daughter's marriage, a son's claim, a husband's authority, a kingdom's survival, a faction's demand, a foreign king's pressure, and the church's language of peace could all converge on the same queen. Any ordinary maternal feeling would have had to move through that iron lattice. And then came memory, which is less patient than history. Memory likes sharp figures. It likes the bad mother, the foreign queen, the corrupt counsellor, the woman who signed away a kingdom. It does not like account books, factional context, legal nuance, military exhaustion, or the problem of not knowing the future. So Isabeau's reputation darkened. Stories about her body and morals gathered around political blame. Her name became easier to use than the complicated machinery of French collapse. A hostile archive does not always lie in a simple way. Sometimes it preserves real events and surrounds them with poisonous meaning. It may remember the treaty, the alliances, the tensions, the spending, the factional closeness, the public roles. But then it explains them through misogyny, foreignness, appetite, and unnatural motherhood. The result feels detailed enough to be convincing and distorted enough to be dangerous. For a sleep history listener, this may sound oddly modern. Not because medieval queens were modern women, but because the pattern is recognizable. When an institution fails, the body nearest the symbolic center is asked to carry the shame. During the 100 Years' War, a queen could become that body. Not always. Not every queen suffered the same fate. Philippa's memory remained largely gentle, partly because her husband's kingship was forceful and successful enough to let her mercy shine beside it. Isabeau's memory curdled in a realm where authority itself had cracked. The contrast is important. It shows that queenly reputation did not come only from personality. It came from political weather. A queen remembered as merciful may have lived under a king whose victories made mercy safe to celebrate. A queen remembered as monstrous may have lived under a crisis that needed a woman-shaped explanation. The same courtly tools, intercession, childbirth, patronage, access, foreign kin, household spending, could produce admiration in one story and accusation in another. So the Queen's life during the 100 Years' War was not a single experience. It changed by kingdom, reign, personality, health, wealth, faction, motherhood, and military fortune. Yet the central mechanism remained. She was asked to make dynastic power visible and stable through a body that everyone felt entitled to interpret. Her marriage could become policy. Her children could become borders. Her letters could become leverage. Her silence could become evidence. Her reputation could become a battlefield after the armies moved on. Imagine, then, a chamber after the treaty language has been read aloud. The candles burn low. A clerk sands the ink. A seal waits. Outside, the city breathes with rumours it does not yet fully understand. Somewhere, a daughter's future has been written into a peace that may not hold. Somewhere, a son has been pushed farther from the crown he still believes is his. And at the centre of that paper world sits the Queen, not as the simple author of disaster, but as the figure through whom disaster is being made to look lawful. The seal does not argue. That is part of its power. Once pressed into wax, it gives a decision a shape that can be carried, shown, copied, obeyed, doubted, hidden, or denounced later. In the quiet after a treaty, the human confusion of fear, fatigue, faction, ambition, and grief becomes a cleaner object. A document can make disaster look orderly. It can place names in lines, titles in sequence, promises in proper language, and make a wounded kingdom appear to have spoken with one voice. But a kingdom rarely speaks with one voice. It speaks through those allowed to write, seal, proclaim, and enforce. For a queen courting that process, the danger was not only what she chose, it was what her presence allowed others to claim. If she stood near a settlement, the settlement could borrow the authority of motherhood, marriage, and royal continuity. If the settlement failed, those same qualities could be turned against her. The mother who made peace could become the mother who betrayed. The wife who upheld the king's order could become the woman who helped strangers take it. Catherine of Valois stepped from this world into another one built from ceremony. Her marriage to Henry V was not simply a private union, and no one pretended it was. It was a public answer to war. It said, through clothing, vows, bodies, and feasting, that English victory and French royal blood could be joined into a single future. A bride could soften conquest by making it look familial. The wedding chamber, like the council chamber, became part of the battlefield's aftermath. For Catherine herself, this meant becoming a new kind of queen under the shadow of two realms, She was French by birth, English by marriage, and valuable because of the very division that might have made her lonely. When she crossed into English queenship, she carried not only her jewels and attendants, but the political dream that her child might inherit both crowns. The war had taken a daughter and turned her into a bridge laid over a river that was still flooding. We should pause with that image, because it is easy to let dynastic language make royal daughters sound weightless. They were not weightless. They had bodies that travelled, languages to adjust to, households to enter, expectations to meet, and reputations to grow inside other people's stories. They might have privileges beyond imagination for ordinary women, yet privilege did not remove the fact that their lives could be redirected by negotiations made above their heads. Queenship could feel like a rival, but it was often another departure. A young queen entered a land that studied her immediately. Her face appeared in ceremony before people knew her character. Her fertility became a question before she had settled into her rooms. Her household became a point of curiosity. Did she bring too many foreign attendants? Would she favour old companions? Would she learn the habits of the new court? Would she become beloved, ignored, resented, or useful? The first months of a queen's new life were therefore full of translation. Not only translation of words, though that mattered, but translation of gestures. The correct rhythm of greeting, the expected form of piety, the amount of generosity that looked royal but not wasteful, the way to sit near the king without seeming to crowd him, the way to receive nobles who were measuring her possible influence, the way to be young and watched by people older, sharper, and already invested in court rivalries. A queen during the 100 Years' War could be moved by marriage from one side of a conflict into the other, and then expected to embody reconciliation. That expectation was almost impossible. People wanted her to carry memory and forget it at the same time. She had to be proof that peace was sincere, yet she could not appear too loyal to the land she had left. She had to honour her birth, but not let it threaten her marriage. She had to become a sign that two houses might be joined. Even while soldiers, taxes, and grieving families remembered why joining was hard. In this sense, a royal wedding was not the opposite of war. It was one of war's quieter instruments. It used music instead of drums, vows instead of arrows, rings instead of chains, but it still aimed at control over the future. The bride's body promised heirs. The heirs promised claims. The claims promised either settlement or another reason to fight. In monarchy, peace often arrived already carrying the seed of its next argument. This was not always cynical. People did hope. They prayed for peace. They wanted children to bind wounds their fathers had opened. They believed, sincerely, that marriage could mend what violence had torn. A queen could share that hope, or learn to perform it, or both. Medieval political life did not divide sincerity and strategy as cleanly as we might wish. A prayer could be real and useful. A marriage could be tender and negotiated. A child could be beloved and politically necessary. That mixture is what makes queenship so difficult to describe honestly. If we make every act cold calculation, we erase the human being. If we make every act emotion, we erase the institution. A queen lived where the two met. She could kneel in prayer with genuine fear for her husband and sons, while also understanding that public piety strengthened her position. She could love a daughter and still consent to sending her away. She could seek peace and still participate in arrangements that harmed someone else. After the Treaty of Troy, the future did not obey the document as neatly as the language hoped. Henry V died young, Charles VI died soon after. The infant Henry VI inherited claims too heavy for a child. The disinherited Dauphin Charles continued his struggle. France did not simply become the settled double kingdom the treaty imagined. Instead, the war moved on, carrying the broken promises and bitter memories with it. For queens, this was another reminder that the papers around them could outlive their certainty. A treaty might look final in candlelight and become provisional in morning history. A marriage might look like closure and become a corridor to more conflict. A son might look excluded and later become king. A daughter might look triumphant and then find herself widowed, displaced, or reduced to the mother of a claim others would manage. The wax hardened. The ink dried. The messengers rode. But the living world kept shifting beneath the words, and the Queen still watched, had to shift with it. The Queen still watched. Had to shift with it because history did not grant her the mercy of a finished scene. A treaty might try to close the door, but dynastic politics kept finding cracks around the frame. A king died. Another king died. A child inherited too much paper and too little strength. Armies kept moving. Factions adjusted their stories. The people who had sworn, celebrated, witnessed, and sealed now had to explain why the world still would not settle. For Catherine of Valois, widowhood came quickly. She had been married into a vast political hope, a hope that England and France might be held together through her body and her child. Then Henry V was dead, and the hope became colder, more administrative, more fragile. Her son, Henry VI, was an infant with titles larger than his cradle. Around him gathered uncles, councils, protectors, soldiers, churchmen, and governors, all speaking in the language of duty while competing over the management of a royal future. A widowed queen could be honoured and restricted at the same time. Her status was high, but her usefulness changed. She was no longer the young bride whose fertility promised the next bond between houses in quite the same way. She was the mother of a child king, and that made her precious, but also dangerous. Whoever stood near the mother might stand near the child. Whoever influenced her might be suspected of influencing access, affection, legitimacy, or inheritance. Widowhood did not mean disappearing into black cloth and silence. Though public mourning mattered deeply, it meant entering a new legal and emotional condition where a queen's body was no longer governed by the same marriage, but was still not fully her own. Her dower, household, movements, remarriage possibilities, and access to her child could all become political questions. The court might honour her grief while also managing the risks of her independence. This is another quiet cruelty of royal womanhood. A queen's marriage was political, and her widowhood was political too. Even loneliness could have a constitutional edge. If she remarried without approval, the match might threaten factions, property, or the standing of the royal child. If she did not remarry, she could be preserved as a dignified maternal figure, but perhaps with her choices narrowed by other people's caution. The realm had already used her as a bridge. Now it feared where else she might lead. Catherine's later life, especially her relationship with Owen Tudor, would eventually open a new branch of history. But for our purposes, what matters is the pattern. A queen did not stop shaping the future when the official diplomatic use of her marriage was over. Her private life, if it became known, could become dynastic matter again. A relationship could become a lineage. A lineage could become a claim. A claim could become a war in another generation. The 100 Years' War teaches this lesson again and again. Royal family life was never safely private. The nursery, the chapel, the marriage bed, the widow's household, the council table, and the sealed letter all belonged to the same political weather. A queen could pass from one role to another, bride to wife, wife to mother, mother to widow, widow to ancestor. and each role carried a new set of watchers. For ordinary people, queenship might have appeared impossibly distant. A peasant woman in a raided village, a townswoman counting the cost of soldiers lodged nearby, a widow trying to recover rent after a campaign, or a servant carrying water through a royal lodging, lived in a different world from the queen. Yet war connected them in strange ways. Taxes raised for campaigns touched households far below the court. Military failure could raise demands. Royal ceremonies could require local labour. A queen's procession could pass through places where people had already paid for the war, in grain, coin, fear, or sons. The queen was not responsible for all of that suffering, but she was part of the image that made the monarchy visible to those who suffered under it. When she gave alms, she softened the face of power. When she entered a church, she made hierarchy look sacred. When she appeared in rich clothing, she displayed the order that taxation claimed to defend. When she interceded, she showed that the crown could listen. These acts could be sincere and still serve the system. That is the difficulty of judging her from a distance. Modern listeners may want to ask whether she was powerful or powerless, privileged or trapped, agent or victim. The honest answer is that she could be all of these in different proportions at different moments. She lived above almost everyone and below the expectations placed on her. She commanded servants and depended on male authority. She influenced policy and was blamed for influence. She possessed wealth and had to justify the appearance of wealth. She could ask for mercy and still belong to a world built on coercion. A queen during the 100 Years' War might sleep in better linen than almost anyone in the realm. But linen does not cancel fear. She might eat from finer vessels, but vessels do not make news easier to hear. She might pray in chapels bright with candles, but candles do not guarantee that suns survive. Treaties hold, husbands remain sane, factions stay loyal, or chroniclers behave kindly. Comfort and insecurity could share the same bedchamber. By the later stages of the war, the symbolic burden of queenship had only grown heavier. France's recovery under Charles VII would draw on new forms of legitimacy, including the astonishing public role of Joan of Arc, whose presence offered a different kind of sacred political theatre. Joan was not a queen, and she should not be folded lazily into queenship, but her rise shows how badly the realm needed bodies that could make divine favour, loyalty, and national hope visible. In a world of broken royal confidence, symbolic bodies mattered intensely. Queens had always done that work in another register. They did not usually appear in armour or claim heavenly voices. They worked through marriage, birth, intercession, piety, patronage, and ceremony. Yet they too carried the problem of visible meaning. Their bodies were read for signs of legitimacy, disorder, mercy, fertility, foreignness, loyalty, and sin. A queen's life was a long exposure to interpretation, and interpretation did not end when she died. Sometimes death softened a queen. Sometimes it hardened blame. Sometimes it left only a few documents, a tomb, a foundation, a rumour, a seal. The living woman became an arrangement of surviving traces, and those traces were gathered by people with their own needs. A kingdom that wanted a merciful past remembered a merciful queen. A kingdom that wanted a villain remembered a foreign mother who had failed. So as the war moved toward its final decades, and as older queens faded from life into memory, their real experience became harder and harder to separate from the uses later generations made of them. The wax remained, the story changed hands, and somewhere under the story, quieter than the scratch of any pen, was the human cost of being made into evidence. To be made into evidence is a strange afterlife. It means that a queen's gestures do not belong only to the day she made them. They are lifted, repeated, sharpened, softened, and sometimes bent until they serve arguments she never heard. A donation becomes proof of holiness. A rumour becomes proof of corruption. A treaty becomes proof of treason. A child becomes proof that God favoured one line and abandoned another. The woman disappears into uses. In life, she had already practiced a kind of disappearance, not because she lacked presence, but because her presence was required to carry meanings larger than herself. She disappeared into the crown when she sat beside the king. She disappeared into motherhood when her children became futures. She disappeared into ceremony when the watching crowd saw role before person. Death made that process colder. Now she could no longer adjust her posture, answer a charge, favour a servant, seal a letter, or choose which chapel received her gift. Others arranged the remains of her meaning. A queen's burial was never just a burial. It was theology, family memory, dynastic statement, and political theatre folded into stone, cloth, incense, and prayer. The body that had carried heirs, worn jewels, knelt in ceremony, travelled through towns and been watched for decades, was prepared for a final public reading. Where she was buried mattered. Near whom she was buried mattered. Which prayers were arranged mattered. Which symbols appeared around her mattered. Even the tomb could speak after the mouth was silent. The tomb might present the queen as serene, crowned, dignified, folded into heavenly order. It might show hands in prayer, garments carved in stone, rank stilled into an image of peace. But such peace is not the same as her life. Stone simplifies. It makes a body that once worried, bled, calculated, endured, hoped, and misunderstood others into an emblem that can be visited, honoured, neglected, damaged, or reinterpreted. The tomb is calm because the political noise has been carved away. Yet the noise remained around it. Monasteries and churches preserved royal memory through masses and anniversaries. Families remembered connections that still mattered. Chroniclers placed queens in stories where they could explain mercy, disorder, legitimacy, scandal, or divine favour. Later generations approached those stories with their own hungers. A queen useful as a saintly mother became gentler. A queen useful as a warning became darker. History, especially political history, often treats women near power as mirrors for the anxieties of men. Philippa's memory benefited from a story that could love her. She stood beside a successful martial kingship without seeming to threaten it. Her fertility strengthened a celebrated dynasty. Her mercy at Calais, whether polished by retelling or not, gave conquest a human face. Her goodness made Edward's power appear more complete, because a great king could afford a merciful queen beside him. In memory, she becomes the soft light on the edge of a hard rain. But even that softness asks questions. What parts of her were left out because they did not fit the gentle image? What ambitions, frustrations, preferences, mistakes, or sharp judgments have vanished because later memory preferred her as merciful wife and fertile mother? To be praised can also be narrowed. A favourable legend is still a legend. It may protect a queen from hatred while keeping her inside a small room of approved virtues. Isabeau's memory suffered from the opposite process. She lived where the monarchy fractured, and the fracture needed explanation. Because she was foreign-born, because she stood near a king whose illness unsettled rule, because she was mother to children placed on opposing political roads, because her name touched the Treaty of Troy, she became available for a darker kind of story. The queen, who had occupied a necessary but perilous position, was reshaped into a cause. That reshaping is not a minor detail. It is one of the central experiences of queenship in a hostile age. A queen's reputation could be constructed from the outside, with materials she did not control. Rumour, moral expectation, factional hatred, gendered suspicion, and the later pleasure of simple blame. A kingdom's failure could be made more memorable by placing a woman's face upon it. The explanation became portable. It could travel more easily than a careful account of councils, campaigns, finances, illnesses, murders, truces, and military defeats. This is why we have to listen for source silence as much as source speech. When a record accuses, we ask who benefits from the accusation. When it praises, we ask what kind of queen the praise required. When it tells us a queen was extravagant, we ask what royal magnificence demanded and who called it excess. When it tells us she influenced the king, we ask whether influence was the problem or whether the wrong person was seen using it. When it calls her unnatural, we listen for the sound of political fear wearing moral clothing. None of this means queens were innocent of every hard choice. They were human beings inside power, and power harms. They benefited from hierarchy. Their households consumed labour. Their dynastic duties could send daughters away and bind sons to violent futures. Their requests could help some people and exclude others. A careful history does not turn them into pure victims. It lets them remain complicated without forcing them into villain or angel. That complication is closer to the truth. A queen during the 100 Years' War could be generous and strategic, devout and political, frightened and privileged, constrained and influential. She could care for her children and still participate in arrangements that wounded one of them. She could seek mercy for strangers while belonging to a monarchy that produced suffering. She could be remembered tenderly for one scene and still remain unknown in many others. So perhaps the real experience of queenship was not one dramatic secret, but a daily practice of living under meanings that never stopped gathering. The crown gathered meaning. The bed gathered meaning. The cradle gathered meaning. The seal gathered meaning. The chapel gathered meaning. The journey, the feast, the letter, the silence, the tomb, all gathered meaning. She moved through objects that made her life visible, while hiding the parts of her that did not fit the official story. And when night came, if a queen had any hour that felt even partly her own, it would still have been surrounded by the faint pressure of tomorrow's performance. Somewhere a clerk kept accounts. Somewhere a messenger slept with news still folded in his bag. Somewhere a child turned in a guarded bed. Somewhere a chapel candle burned for a soul, a victory, a husband, a son, a peace that might fail. The queen might lie beneath rich fabric, but the kingdom did not leave her alone. The kingdom did not leave her alone because queenship was not a shelter from history. It was one of the places where history came to rest. The news that troubled a court might enter first as a sound in the corridor, a faster step than usual, a voice lowered near the door. Then it became a letter, then a consultation, then a decision, then a memory. By the time later generations saw it, the moment had usually been cleaned of its trembling. But the trembling was real. A queen might wake to a day already arranged by other people's needs. Prayers before breakfast, household matters, a petition awaiting, cloth to approve, a letter to consider, a child to visit, an envoy to receive, a ceremony to attend, a rumour to answer without seeming to answer it. She could be surrounded by luxury and still have very little empty space around her mind. The bed itself could not be innocent. In a royal house, the bed was where marriage became succession, where illness might weaken a dynasty, where childbirth began, where grief sat beside a cooling body, where doctors, priests, women, and servants crossed thresholds modern people would call private. A queen's bed could be curtained, guarded, warmed, perfumed, and richly dressed. But it was not simply personal. It belonged to the future. That is why privacy, for her, was less a room than a small, temporary mercy. Perhaps it came in the half-light before attendants entered, perhaps in a chapel moment when the words of prayer covered thought, perhaps in the quiet after a messenger had gone, before anyone asked what answer should be sent. Perhaps while touching an object no record cared about, a rosary bead, a sleeve edge, a small book, the hair of a sleeping child. Those are the moments history rarely keeps. It keeps the official thing, it keeps the seal, the charter, the foundation, the accusation, the marriage contract, the account, the tomb. It keeps the objects that interacted with power. It lets the smaller human gestures fall through. And yet, if we are careful, we can feel the outline of those lost gestures because the official objects pressed so hard against the person. The seal tells us she had to authorize and be represented. The wardrobe tells us she had to appear. The accounts tell us she had to maintain a household. The petitions tell us people needed her nearness. The rumors tell us her reputation was vulnerable. The treaties tell us her family life was political. The tomb tells us even death had an audience. This is the deeper answer to the title. What was it really like to be a queen during the 100 Years' War? It was not simply to be pampered while men fought outside. It was to become a living crossing point between war and domestic life. The conflict touched her not only through maps and armies, but through marriage negotiations, childbirth pressure, household expense, ceremonial duty, factional blame, and the long afterlife of reputation. If she was fortunate, like Philippa in memory, the story around her might soften into piety, fertility, and mercy. But that softness was still a role. It still asked her to represent the kingdom's moral balance. She could be loved for kneeling, loved for asking mercy, loved for giving the king's power a gentler face. Yet the praise worked partly because it kept her power inside acceptable shapes. She was permitted to be influential when influence looked like compassion. If she was unfortunate, like Isabeau in Hostile Memory, the story around her might darken until nearly every act became suspicious. The same basic materials of queenship could turn poisonous: foreign birth, household spending, political access, motherhood, diplomacy, marriage, survival inside crisis. A queen did not have to be powerless to be vulnerable. In fact, her vulnerability often came from being visible enough to matter. Between those two memories, gentle Philippa and blackened Isabeau, lies the wide human middle, where most experience actually lives. A queen could be neither saint nor monster. She could be practical, tired, devout, proud, affectionate, guarded, generous, mistaken, brave in small ways and cruel in ways she barely noticed because hierarchy made them ordinary. She could live a life of extraordinary privilege and still be trapped by the duties that made that privilege possible. The war gave those duties an edge. It made lineage urgent. It made marriage heavier. It made children more valuable and more endangered. It made foreignness sharper. It made spending easier to attack. It made mercy more theatrical. It made letters more dangerous. It made every public appearance part of a larger attempt to persuade people that the royal order still held. Think again of a queen entering a hall. The surface is beautiful. Light catches on metal thread. A train of fabric moves behind her. People bow. Musicians lower their sound. Servants hold still. She seems elevated above ordinary life. But beneath that surface, the whole system is working. Her gown has been paid for from revenues someone collected. Her jewels have histories of gift, inheritance, or debt. Her ladies represent families. Her steps have been rehearsed by custom. Her face is being read for confidence, grief, health, favour, restraint. One wrong sign may not ruin her, but signs accumulate. A court is a place where accumulation becomes judgment. Too much favour here, too little warmth there, too many foreign servants, too much spending, too much counsel, not enough motherhood, too much motherhood directed toward the wrong child. The Queen does not merely walk through the room quietly writes her, and she writes back, though not always in the ways later people expect. She writes through patronage, through whom she protects, through the prayers she funds, through the marriages she supports, through the gifts she gives, through the mercy she requests, through the household she maintains, through the dignity she performs when everything around her is breaking. Her authorship is scattered. It does not always look like command. It looks like traces. Even stillness had to be made. Attendants adjusted fabric. Clerks prepared formulas. Priests shaped public devotion into acceptable words. The Queen's composure was supported by a small army of ordinary labour, and that labour made her seem almost effortless. That may be why the seal remains such a powerful image. A seal is both presence and absence. It shows a queen, but not her changing face. It speaks with authority, but not with breath. It can travel, but cannot explain itself. Once pressed into wax, it bears the shape expected of her, crowned, composed, legitimate, still. The living woman behind it was never so still. The living woman behind it was never so still. She aged, as anyone ages, through seasons of heat, cold, illness, childbirth, waiting, and news. Her face changed while the seal kept the same ideal shape. Her body tired while the image remained composed. Her household shifted as servants died, married, rose, failed, or were replaced. Children grew into political beings. Allies disappeared. Enemies changed names. The war that had once seemed like one crisis became a long weather pattern, something that could outlast youth, outlast certainty, and outlast the people who believed they could control it. This long duration is part of what made queenship during the 100 Years' War so heavy. It was not one dramatic test, it was the accumulation of tests. A queen might endure a campaign season, then a truce, then a marriage negotiation, then a death, then another tax, then another rumour, then another journey, then another child sent away, then another treaty whose language promised what no one could guarantee. Her life was not shaped only by events large enough for chronicles. It was shaped by the slow return of pressure. A siege could end, but the cost remained. A battle could be won, but widows remained. A treaty could be signed, but suspicion remained. A child could be married, but homesickness remained. A king could recover from illness for a time, but fear remained. because everyone had seen the crack in authority. The Queen lived among these remainders. She did not need to stand on a battlefield to be touched by aftermath. Aftermath entered through accounts, prayers, silences, and faces at court. Even victory carried its own demands. A victorious king needed display. A queen beside him had to help turn success into legitimacy. There would be ceremonies of thanksgiving, gifts, public appearances, perhaps acts of mercy or patronage that framed conquest as divinely favoured order. The Queen's presence could soften triumph, making it appear not merely violent, but righteous, stable, and blessed. She was part of the emotional management of victory. Defeat asked different work from her. Defeat required composure without denial. It required prayer, economy, careful speech, and perhaps the comfort of people who could not be comforted openly. A queen could not fall apart in the way an ordinary person might wish to. Her grief, if public, had to have form. Her fear, if visible, had to be dignified. Her uncertainty had to pass through ritual until it became bearable for others to witness. This does not mean she always succeeded. No one could. Courts were not smooth machines filled with perfect performers. They were tense, human places where tempers sharpened, accounts failed, servants gossiped, nobles sulked, letters arrived late, and people misread each other. A queen could make mistakes. She could trust the wrong person, spend unwisely, favour too openly, hesitate too long, or speak at the wrong moment. The difference was that her mistakes had more witnesses and longer shadows. And because she was a woman near sovereign power, those shadows often took gendered shapes. A king's error might be called misjudgment, bad counsel, youthful heat, age, illness, or military necessity. A queen's error could become vanity, appetite, weakness, seduction, foreign corruption, failed motherhood, or unnatural ambition. The vocabulary around her was narrower and more dangerous. It did not only criticize what she did, it judged what kind of woman she was allowed to be. This is why the Queen's virtues had to be managed like treasures. Piety, chastity, charity, fertility, humility, loyalty, mercy, magnificence, and restraint, all had to be displayed in proper proportion. Too little magnificence weakened the crown. Too much magnificence looked wasteful. Too little influence made her useless. Too much influence looked threatening. Too little mercy made her cold. Too much mercy could seem like interference. The virtues themselves could become traps when measured by hostile eyes. A queen learned this not from a manual alone, but from correction. The pause after a remark, the glance between courtiers, the coolness of a noble wife who had expected a favour, the sudden warmth of a bishop whose monastery received a gift, the careful way a clerk phrased a letter so that her request sounded humble enough to pass. Court education never ended. It continued through embarrassment, praise, delay, and danger. If we listen closely, we can hear how much labour went into appearing natural. The Queen's grace was trained. Her silence was trained. Her generosity was organised through accounts. Her holiness was supported by chaplains and candles. Her beauty was assembled by cloth workers, jewel keepers, laundresses, and attendants. Her motherhood was surrounded by nurses, midwives, ladies, priests, and political expectation. Her authority was never a single thing she possessed. It was something many people helped produce, while many others stood ready to challenge it. That collective production makes queenship less like a fairy tale and more like an institution wearing a human face. The woman mattered deeply. but she did not stand alone. Her face made the institution visible. Her body gave it continuity. Her voice could make it gentle. Her womb could give it heirs. Her kneeling could make it merciful. Her clothing could make it splendid. Her tomb could make it eternal. Yet each of these uses took something from the private self and placed it in public hands. By the final decades of the war, the meaning of monarchy itself was changing under the strain. Military failure, taxation, civil division, popular suffering, and competing claims forced rulers to work harder to explain why obedience still made sense. Queens were part of that explanation. They helped make dynastic order feel sacred, familial, and continuous. They offered the image of a royal household at the centre of a fractured world, even when the household itself was full of fractures. So being a queen in this conflict meant living inside contradiction until contradiction felt ordinary. She could be sheltered and exposed, powerful and limited, loved and used, rich and dependent, honoured and watched, central and replaceable, remembered and misunderstood. She could influence the course of events without controlling the story later told about her. She could survive the war in body and still lose the battle over memory. And memory, by now, is where we are walking, not away from the rooms, but deeper into their after-image. The hall has emptied. The petitioners are gone. The child has grown into a claim. The letter has been folded into a bundle. The seal has hardened in a drawer. The queen has passed from the dangerous present into the quieter danger of being described. What remains is not the full woman, but the trace power allowed her to leave. The trace power allowed her to leave is never enough, and yet it is not nothing. A seal impression, a household account, a chapel gift, a marriage agreement, a rumour darkened by politics, a story of mercy softened by time. These fragments do not give us the whole queen, but they give us the pressure around her. They show the shape of the room, even when the woman in the room remains partly hidden. By the end of the 100 Years' War, much had changed around the institution that made her. English power in France had risen, hardened, overreached, and receded. French kingship, wounded and divided, had found ways to gather itself again. Towns had changed hands. Noble houses had shifted loyalties. Soldiers had come and gone, leaving fear, memory, and debt behind them. The war did not end with one clean sigh. It faded through campaigns, recoveries, losses, negotiations, and the slow exhaustion of possibilities. Queens lived inside that long fading. Some were already dead by the time later outcomes gave meaning to their choices. Some had been turned into symbols before the final shape of the war was known. Philippa could be remembered as merciful in a story where English kingship still looked grand. Isabeau could be remembered as ruinous in stories that needed the French collapse to have a face. Catherine could be remembered as a bride, widow, mother, and ancestor. Her life pulled forward into dynasties she never saw. None of them can be reduced to the uses made of them. That is the quiet promise we owe the dead. A queen was not only a lesson, not only a symbol, not only a body used by law, not only a convenient explanation for male failure or royal success, and not merely a painted figure placed beside a king to make the page look complete. She was a person, moving through rooms with changing light, hearing footsteps outside doors, learning which servant could be trusted, which courtier smiled too quickly, which letter must be answered before night. Still, We should not rescue her by pretending she was just like us. Her world was not ours in costume. She believed, feared, prayed, judged, and obeyed within assumptions that can feel distant now. Hierarchy seemed natural to many around her. Dynasty was not an abstract cruelty, but the framework through which peace, order, and inheritance were imagined. Marriage could be affection and strategy at once. A child could be beloved and politically assigned. Mercy could be sincere and useful. Piety could be inward and public in the same breath. That mixture is what makes her real. The Queen, during the 100 Years' War, was not a fairy tale prisoner tapping at a tower window, nor a secret master directing kings from behind a curtain. She was closer to a candle in a drafty chapel, sheltered by walls, watched by everyone, needed for the light she gave, and vulnerable to every movement of the air. Her day might begin with prayer, but prayer did not remove politics. Her clothing might be beautiful, but beauty did not remove labor. Her meals might be rich, but richness did not remove anxiety. Her children might be kissed, blessed, negotiated, and sent away. Her letters might sound graceful while carrying fear between the lines. Her household might hum with discipline while gossip slipped through it like smoke. And always there was war, sometimes near, sometimes distant, sometimes loud, sometimes only present as cost. War in the tax, war in the delayed payment, war in the marriage clause, war in the empty place where a young nobleman should have returned, war in the city that opened its gates, war in the chapel where prayers were said for victory, peace, childbirth, forgiveness, and the dead. War did not have to enter the Queen's chamber with a sword. It could enter as news. Perhaps that is why the seal is still the right place to end. Not because wax is dramatic, but because it is small enough to hold the contradiction. A Queen's seal shows authority, but it also shows confinement. It carries her image, but not her breath. It can command attention, but cannot explain hesitation. It survives because institutions preserve what they need, not because they understand the full human life behind it. Picture it now, resting in an archive drawer or attached to a charter, browned by age, its edges chipped, its once clear figure softened by centuries. The crown is still visible, maybe the outline of a gown, perhaps the posture expected of queenship. Around it there may be words naming titles, rights, rank, and legitimacy. The wax says she was present. The silence says how much presence has been lost. Somewhere behind that silence is the girl sent from one court to another, the bride learning how to be watched, the mother hearing that a child's marriage has been proposed, the wife measuring the king's mood, the patron choosing a chapel, the intercessor kneeling at the correct distance, the foreign queen hearing her birthplace turned into suspicion, the widow discovering that even grief has rules, the older woman, perhaps, understanding that memory will not ask her permission. We cannot give her back everything. We cannot restore the tone of her voice in a private room. We cannot know every motive behind every gift, every smile, every silence. But we can refuse the cheap version. We can refuse the Queen as decoration, the Queen as monster, the Queen as simple victim, the Queen as secret ruler of everything. We can let her remain difficult, because difficulty is often where the truth has survived. So what was it really like to be a queen during the 100 Years' War? It was to live where the softest things became political. Marriage, birth, mercy, prayer, clothing, letters, reputation, even silence. It was to be surrounded by comfort and never fully free from danger. It was to be praised for virtues that confined you, blamed for powers others needed you to use, and remembered through records that kept your image more carefully than your inner life. And as the night settles, we can leave her there, not on a throne, not on a battlefield, but in the half-lit space between a folded letter and a cooling seal. The messenger has gone. The candle has lowered. The wax has taken its shape. Somewhere beyond the walls, the war continues to move through roads, fields, councils, and unborn claims. In the chamber, the Queen's hand lifts away from the seal, and for one quiet second, before history hardens around her, she is still warm.